Welcome to Norse Talk, information of the gods. I am the Red-Bearded Viking. This is Red Dranger, and tonight we'll be going over Chapter 4 of the Asatru, Ancestry and Worship and Heathenry. For you, those of you that aren't already following us on Insta or the Discord, links are in our bio. Click them there, along with the three top support pages to help support and keep this going, you guys. And I think we're ready to go. So, how's your night going, Red?
It's been really good. I had a chance to reread the chapter again today. I really like this chapter. Ancestry worship is kind of a interesting thing to debate, especially live on TikTok. So I have been looking forward to this episode. Um, Again, tonight we are working out of ancestry worship and heathenry. I do want to point out, guys, and again, like I said at the beginning of the episode, I'm going to be doing this a lot tonight. You do not need to have Norse ancestors to be a part of this. So please don't think that while we're talking about this, that your ancestry needs to be anything, or it needs to be Norse. It can be anything. Ancestry worship is not about just the Norse ancestors. Um, Everybody comes from somewhere, and it's important to recognize that. Um, we're all learning a lot about our own ancestry, about our own pasts. That's a big part of the building block of modern heathenry coming back in. A lot of us are on, or have been, or are still on that path. Redbeard, he's only been at it for a couple of months, so I would be really interesting to know what his ancestry, well, not his, but what he feels about it.
Right. So, um, one thing that I really liked about this chapter is how it gets into different ways to worship the ancestry and everything. Being that I come from Irish and Norwegian descent, along with a lot of other descents. So I have a lot of different background in different areas. But I did grow up as a Catholic, so ancestry worship was not part of growing up for me. So it's something that I'm learning more and more about now, the traditions to keep my family name going and keep our history going of our ancestry. And that's pretty much what this chapter is talking about. I'm going to let Red talk about the Zura the Blots.
Yeah, so getting into this chapter right away, they do talk about the basics of ancestor worship and how it's been a part of pretty much every major non-mono faith going back to the Stone Age. There's evidence in Europe and pretty much on every continent about some sort or other of ancestry worship. Uh, the Northern European tribunal people were no exceptions. A great deal of saga evidence placed names to reveal ancestral worship, offerings, sacrifices, particularly the Dizir during the events such as the Disblot and Mother's Night. Guys, at the end of the book, so in this, sorry, at the end of the chapter, in this chapter, you're going to see little numbers besides some of the names. If you do hit a name that you're a little unfamiliar with, flip over to the back of your chapter there. It'll give you a quick description on it. I'm not going to get too much into that because I'm going to have to start doing some of the longer words, and you guys know how I butcher that kind of stuff. The singular word "diz" can refer to ancestress, and it's important that we distinguish that there is assigned gender to some of the names that we're going to talk about tonight. It can refer to ancestress, known to guard the family line. It can also mean women, which is how it is frequently used in modern heathenism. The goddesses there, so it's also another word that describes the goddesses as well. So it is one of those words in heathenry that does have more than one meaning. So, like everything in heathenry that has more than one meaning, it can tend to be conflicted with some people. There are groups of people that believe it only means one thing and only means that. So keep an open mind as we're moving through here because we are going to be touching on a couple of different topics. Hilda Ridrick Ellis Davidson agrees, discussing the term Dizir and adding that it seems to include the female guardian spirits attached to certain individuals or families. So that is kind of our first step into ancestral worship today, is talking about the female guardian spirits and how they can be linked to certain individuals, certain families, and it does go back generations. So the guardian spirits or the ancestors that look at after you are kind of like a part of your daily life, and that they are active in looking out for you. They're there to give advice sometimes, and so on and so forth. And that's why people respect them. From the ancestor, yeah, just talk about that. There's in Icelandic manuscripts, and I'm really not going to try to pronounce that name, guys, because it is Icelandic, and my Icelandic is horrid. Discusses the Winter's Night Feast, where Theodore felt that someone would die when he warned everybody not to go outside. So, and somebody answered the door. And I found this part really interesting, is because they spoke of the 9 in black and the 9 in white, and that the black attacked, he was dead the next morning. But the last word of that, where they said that it was that one group represented the new, and one group kind of represented the elder way of looking at things, and I found that really interesting. And I haven't really had a lot of time to do more research into that, but I wondered if that was at all linked to kind of the pre-entry of like the conversion period. And I don't really know how to phrase it. There's something in that statement that really piqued my interest, and I haven't sorted it out yet.
And I may be wrong about this, but one of the ways that I kind of looked at the interpretation of the 9 white, which were the virtuous, and the 9 black, which were the devious, it kind of made me think of both sides of um, the 9 virtues, of whether you follow them or not.
The number 9 we see show up, like we talk about the realms, the virtues, the 9 mothers of Heimdall. Like the number 9 shows up a lot, and it seems to be linked to almost like the cosmos in a way. It's how everything is joined. So you see that coming, and the fact that there was 9 dressed in white and 9 dressed in black, and that both the theories were kind of contradicting with each other, seemed really interesting. Like I actually want to read pretty much that entire manuscript now, just to try to get a little bit more information out of it. So by and large, the Desir were seen as helpful spirits. So I know that when we just talked about the 9 in black, 9 in white, there is reference to them sometimes being deviant or miscreant or with ungood purpose. Most of the sagas, when it comes to the Desir, are about them being helpful spirits.
Right, and then it goes in to talk about how the Desir, they seem to travel directly with the descendants, offering help, volunteering advice, generally maintaining the family's well-being, basically. And it refers to a kind of ancestral or folk soul that flows from generation to generation, where each generation is contributing to that soul. And it also goes in to say there's some evidence indicating a belief in multiple soul parts, meaning that a person's spirit is not simply one soul, but a combination of many, which I found very interesting. Because it shows how, just like it'll talk about later when you're talking about your ancestry or your ancestries, and you're giving things to them and everything by mentioning them by name, it goes on to add the more names, the more it adds on to exactly what they're talking about here with the connection. And then it goes on to talk about stretching back to the beginning, offering both old and new. And then we start talking about the male ancestry deed, and which are harder to pinpoint. There's no direct name for the male, like there is for the female part of it, and they have no specific name, and it seems to reside in their burial mounds or graves that rather than traveling descendant to descendant. And it talks about the burial mounds in Sweden were not only large, but they also had small ones, and the outstanding ones were the graves of the kings who reigned long before the Viking Age. So it's showing that this goes back to the ancestral worship goes back to even before the Viking Age, and there's even some consensus that might go back as far as the Stone Age, which is mentioned in here as well, which I found really interesting how far back they've been able to trace it, the practice.
So I found it really interesting that they tied the male spirit to the word land spirit, and that was honestly something that I didn't really know a lot about. They actually, so the word Alf or elf is, and again, this is where we get really conflicted, is that word was used to describe some of these male land spirits, but it was also a word that was used to describe another group as well. So again, it became kind of conflicting, and there are a lot of people that won't use that word now to describe the land spirits because it does mean something else completely at the same time.
Right. And like the owls and the elves part I found interesting, especially when it talked about the different kinds.
Yeah.
Where there's the light elves and the dark elves, because I'm not even going to try and pronounce the two words when it talks about them. So we're just going to say the light elves and the dark elves, and that these beings are in no way connected to the ancestral dead. And they're different kinds of owls in which appears the male ancestral dead may be only one kind among many, which that kind of confused me a little bit.
Yeah. I shared that with you. It led to them that point where it says modern heathens tend to say that the Alfar or elf male ancestors are more connected with the land they are buried on. Specifically, it's if that's family land. So they kind of went on to, which clarified it for me a little bit because it tied those spirits or those people to a specific locked area. So you could kind of differentiate them from the other beings that have those names because their roles in worship and the realms were quite different.
Right, because I was pretty confused until they started talking about their connection with the land that they're buried on, and especially how that you were saying with the family land. And then it starts going into talking about the giving up of offerings were left at the burial mounds, and also called Hughes and Yule and other holy times. Blood or milk seem to be offered in times of famine as well. And in the book Road to Hilda Davison speaks at length about the small hollow depressions found in the stones near the grave mounds, which, from what I understand, is where they put the offerings into.
Yeah, they referred to them as elf cups. There was tiny little into the stone where little offerings were left at the mounds and around the mouth.
That's pretty cool how they had that built-in shelf like that, though, just like they incorporated that in the design.
Yeah, well, and it stands the test of time that way. You know what I mean? That there's still evidence in some of the more ancient places. You can still see evidence of this stuff. There are still parts of the world where that is still kind of practiced. The offerings of food and stuff like that are still left on the burial mounds, which are done very differently than they are in North America.
Right. Yeah, because you don't see much of that up here in our area.
No.
It also means that heathenry is focused on many things, but one of its strongest focuses is on the ancestral worship. And they take pride in the accomplishments of their ancestors. Heathens will evaluate their ancestors and ask them for advice, make offerings to them, and keep heal rooms around the house. Which, um, in a way, we've kind of done that with my background, with it not being that. We didn't do like offerings to ancestors or anything. Um, and really, except for the prior generation, like my grandparents, grandparents were never really taught about much. So it's just like the more immediate generations and maybe the first generation that's passed that's ever really been talked about. But it's like when it starts talking about part of it is having mementos that you keep that were from your ancestors. Like I have mementos of both my grandparents that every time that I look at them remind me of my grandparents. I have my grandparents' hand drawn wedding picture up on my wall in my house.
Nice. That's cool. Um, there's a really important word in that last paragraph where it speaks to heathens take pride in the accomplishments of their ancestors. And again, this is a really touchy issue because there is a lot of negative stereotype in and amongst out there where when you're talking about your ancestors that they're being worshipped because of what they were, and that's where we see a lot of conflicting problems in the community is again you're recognizing them for what their accomplishments were, what they did for the community, what they did in their lives, the honor that they earned. It wasn't about who they were or what they were, it was about what they did. And that comes back to that same old phrase about judging a people by their actions and their character instead of who and what they are. And this
Right.
reaches back as far, and it is still something that we are modernly still struggling with.
No, I totally agree. And then I love how it starts going into parts in the Havamal, where it talks about, and we're not even going to try and pronounce the other pronunciation, so we're just going to read the second part, where it says, "Cattle die and kindred die. You will die as well. But the reputations of the ones who earned good renown never dies." And this talks about two different things. It talks about the reputation of a person um, and how it will remain long after he or she has died. And then it also goes into the inference immortality. If one's reputation never dies, then that person is remembered. And if their reputation is a good one, then they shall live on after death. And then it goes into a little bit more of the same, adding to it, where it says, "Cattle die and kinsmen die. You will die as well. I know one thing that never dies, the judgment destiny of those now dead." Which that one, what it's talking about is dead have their own destinies as well. And a good reputation will lead to a good destiny. Being remembered is, after all, the one certain way to gain immortality that we heathens have. But then it also goes in to say, should a person's reputation be negative, that will mean his or her destiny can be quite different. It puts two stanzas together, what we have in the message about immortality and perhaps the afterlife being the direct attachment to the good reputation. How he even speak the names of their ancestors to tell stories, make offerings to them, and toast them in symbols, and how they're doing it to keep them alive and make them immortal. Where that's talking about the ancestry that was good that you want to continue living on. And then we're going to start here in a second be talking about, and I'm going to let Red talk about this part when we're talking about forgetting ancestry on purpose.
Yeah, so like in all life, not everybody's good. We have ancestors that, even modernly, going back again in North American history, going back a few hundred years, even just a few decades, there has been a lot of growth and a lot of change in the world, and there's been a lot of different views on what is and is not honorable act with how we deal with each other. And that just gets into the basics of it. We also have a lot of family dynamics where there are people that don't know their family. There are a lot of people out there that are adopted or that have never met their family or that have left families for very different reasons, and those families may not have been honorable people themselves. And the book does a really good job about describing that just because you're honoring your ancestors does not mean that you're honoring not just all of their actions, but all of them in particular. If when you're looking back at the past and about who you want to who you're trying to pay respects to, and if there is a name that's not somebody that you want to pay respects to, sometimes the right thing to do is to deliberately leave them out of that activity of like, and it gets a little bit more into in more detail into the blots where it says setting a plate for the ancestors. If while you're setting that plate and while
Right.
you're
And
speaking to your
when it was
yeah
when it was talking about the forgetting of not mentioning them to forget it, it's like, I don't know why, it's just where my mind goes, but it's like, as an example, I was thinking, if you had back in your ancestry a serial killer, you might not want to continue on that name so that
exactly
you can forget throughout time that that was part of your family's heritage.
exactly you're not paying
I
respects
think,
to that individual. You're not making that
right. You're
individual
not trying to keep that name alive and honor that name after
yeah
it kind of disemboweled the name of your family.
yeah well, and it leads into common day practice too. We separate ourselves from people that bring in, I mean, we talk about it all the time when we talk about the negative energy into the different rooms and to the different lives. When there's something like that that exists in your own ancestry or your own past or even your own direct family line, removing that from being a part of your story and carrying that forward is an okay thing to do. You don't have you need to remember the bad, but you don't need to pay respects to it in order to show respects to your ancestors.
Right.
We all have different stories. We all come from different backgrounds. So a blot that people are doing together in regards to the ancestors is going to look very different to different people and what their memories are. Some people know nothing about their background. Some people, like if you, I don't know if we're far enough into this to talk about this yet, but when you look at different cultures, like even a lot of Icelandic people, they can reiterate their ancestral line very far back. Where in North America, that's not something that's done.
Yeah, the
Again, that
book even talks about how with the Americans, especially, I mean, it's straight out of mentions Americans,
yeah,
uh, how we don't tend to, we most of us can't even recite much past our grandparents.
yep,
We may be able to cite like, you already know your grandfather's line is your line, and you may know your grandmother's maiden last name, and a lot of people after that don't know what other ancestry comes from that side.
yeah. Well, it just gets really interesting that way because when it comes to the ancestors and the carrying that memory forward, it was something that was really not encouraged with monotheism. You know what I mean? There were a lot of direct references during the conversion where honoring and putting out offerings to the ancestors was looked at as being worshiping part of a false idol, that kind of, and that culture really has rooted itself in North American life, and we're just now seeing a kind of change where it's accepted very differently in other parts of the world.
Right, and that's where the book kind of goes into. how a lot of heathens practice genealogy, and the study of one family tree or direct line to ancestry, and linking a lot of people can link their genealogies to gods, and was common throughout the medieval period. It was seen as a way for ruling families to maintain their credibility, is by
Yeah.
linking their heritage back to a god.
Yeah. Well, and that was like when we talked in the first chapter. I'll go all the way back to the first chapter again. It was noted very directly that there are a lot of heathens that believe that the original ancestors were the gods and goddesses, were the Asir and the Vanir,
Right.
where they even touched on it with Heimdall, where he was kind of the father of the social creation, where the gods were the original ancestors of people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So it gets really interesting because again, there are still modernly groups of people that can say that they can tie their lineage back that far. Um, that needs to be looked at with a grain of salt, especially when you're talking about internet stuff, and we all know that. Um, but it's just really, really interesting. It is such a different ancestor worship is often one of the last things modern heathens will start getting into because it is so far removed from the cultural backgrounds that a lot of us come from, and not just come from, but are surrounded by. You know what I mean?
Right.
When you look at pop culture, when you look at anything, it's always very much mono. It's very much this is who you worship. This is who you. There's a being. There's an almighty. There's and this gets back to the roots. And again, with it talking about the land spirits and stuff, brings it back to nature. You know, the burial mounds were putting those people back into the world, back into nature, and worshiping that as a part of nature. And it's honestly, it was really refreshing to read again and get that reminder because it's really easy for us to forget about that in our very modern lives.
Well, and I like how the book emphasizes on the fact of listening to these heathens recite the names of their ancestors during a blot or stumble can be a powerful and moving experience. I mean, can you, like, for somebody like me that, like, I've never been around something like that, like, that would be pretty moving to listen
Mm-hmm.
to somebody recite their heritage and know their heritage that well, that they're not like reading it off a piece of paper or anything. Like, I got to look at a family tree to go back more than 4 generations.
Yeah, and we do see. So okay, I've never seen it in person with regards to the Norse faith. Us in North America, we're really blessed that we have a really strong First Nations community and communities all around. And there are a lot of really strong ancestral beliefs inside a lot of their communities. And they place a lot of value on that. And actually getting to sit and listen to how they still do pass those stories down in that exact same way is really cool to be a part of. So if you don't have a Norse community near you, and you're trying to explore that kind of side, there are other groups and other communities that do that kind of stuff, and it is, yeah, the word powerful is what it is. It's powerful to see somebody call back their lines, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of years, and still be able to tell the stories of what those people did in their lives before we were even ideas, and that's awesome.
No, it is, because it's like, it for me, that's like unheard of. But I have heard other families that, like, will talk about their heritage and how they came to America from other countries, how, their grandparents came here, had nothing, and built this and that. And, I just, in my family line, none of that was ever really talked about
Yeah.
like that. But I have heard it in other places, and it's amazing when you hear it. And it makes me, back then I'd hear it and I think it was amazing, but it's like now, I am at the point in my life that it's like I want to start researching that and find more about my family heritage and what they did and what they're about and everything, because I've shown red. Like, my mom did our whole genealogy, and I've got a stack that big of my heritage. You know, it's just crazy. Just tracing the family lines back so far.
Yeah.
And then it comes into the part where it talks about common practice is to list the family names known regardless. And that can be equally as moving to listen to the family names being recited as it is to listen to the names and the heritage. That it can be just as moving either way. And then that'll bring us into ancestral offerings, um, which offerings, gifts to the ancestors. The typical approach, according to this, is to offer food or drink to them. And they're best to offer to ancestors the food and drinks that they loved best in life if you know them, and may know some of these directly since they knew the family member while they were alive, and they may remember either their favorite food or their favorite recipe or their favorite drink.
Yeah.
Because it's like,
This
for
this
me,
is
it's like, for me, I can refer back to my grandparents because that's like the farthest back I go. And, you know, I remember my grandmother, she would drink vodka and lemonade, and my grandfather would drink bourbon straight. And, you know, it's funny because their heritage is like the era that they grew up in is different than the era I grew up in. So, like, it wasn't unusual for them to have cocktails pretty much all day long because that's just how they grew up. Because it's like my grandfather would come home from work for lunch, and he would make him and my grandmother a drink and have a drink and have a little lunch and have another drink and go back to work.
Yeah.
And it's like, you do that nowadays, you come back from lunch smelling like booze, you're going to get canned.
Yeah, it's a different culture now. um, it when it talks about what Redbeard just talked about the favorite foods and stuff like that, this is actually a really cool exercise or thing to try to attempt for your guys' yourselves. A lot of us, and again, it doesn't have to be a direct ancestor. An ancestor family isn't always just blood. So if you don't have direct family, if you don't remember your direct family, that's fine. If you have somebody that's gone that was important into your life, this works as well. It talks about setting a plate at the table and offering that plate the first portion of every part of that meal. And this is something that every modern heathen, especially who's just kind of getting their feet wet with the ancestor stuff, it's a really cool exercise to do because you are gonna, I can pretty much guarantee you're gonna feel something while you're doing it. Um, but it's a really cool exercise to try to go through. It's not something where you need to have a big ceremony over necessarily, or it needs to be a big thing. This could be something you can do at the table with just your family. You know, you set that place for a grandparent that's gone or a family member that's passed on that you remember, and go through the motions. And you'll be surprised the kind of reaction you'll get from it. It's a really cool experience.
Yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to like trying at some point. I
Yeah.
think that would be really cool. You know, at like a Christmas dinner or like a Thanksgiving dinner type thing. You know, something that typically they were a huge part of.
Yeah.
Um, to just set a plate for them and, you know, just say a little bit about them in remembrance, and, you know.
Not just remembrance, but telling their stories. I mean, this is a great time. I mean, a lot of us have young children, and they don't know a lot of the stories about our grandparents. They don't our great grandparents. So it's a really cool time to set that plate and then tell the stories, just like it was done back then. It's kind of a different method here, but passing that information on to the next generation is paying respect to the ancestors. It fits that mold. And again, it's a really cool and interesting way to get into the practice and to create some really cool dialogue with your own family.
Right. And when we get in the red room later, I'll share a funny story about my grandfather with you guys that I think you'll get a kick out of. So and that's what we were just talking about was the ancestral offerings, you guys. And he was talking about setting. I like the aspect of tipping the chair up as well, so nobody sits in it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and
Instead
you
of
can
just,
even use if you have china sets. There's a lot of people modernly that collect china sets or other meal prep or meal service items from their grandparents, their parents. A lot of that stuff is still passed on. So if you do have a favorite bowl or a favorite china set that belonged to that ancestor, use it. Like that is the perfect time to be pulling that stuff out and telling those stories and showing respect to it. It's honestly, if you've never tried it, it's a really really cool thing to do.
yeah, I think it'd be cool. I want to try it for sure. And then it goes to say after the meal is complete, food and drink are offered out to the ancestors, and you can simply leave the plate out on the counter for an hour or two before clearing it away, or even leave it out the back in the backyard or outdoors at an altar space overnight, and basically let the animals have it. And it's important to make sure like with Red was talking about the china. If it's your grandparents' good china that's in remembrance of, you probably don't want to set that outside.
No.
And then it talks about how a smaller version of doing this, you can offer a shot glass or other small items worth of food and drink to the ancestors and leaving it on the ancestor altar in your home if you have one. If you have any kind of altar to your ancestors, someplace that you keep a remembrance of your family, you can always put it on there as well. But also to remember to thank your ancestors for the many gifts that their heritage has brought you.
Yeah. So again, guys, I'm going to say the warning again. This doesn't need to be strictly Norse ancestors that you're speaking to. It doesn't have to have anything to do with that. If you don't come from a Norse background, if you don't come from a Norse bloodline, paying respect to your ancestors is paying respect to your ancestors. Again, we are looking at the deeds that they've done, not who they are because of who they are. And that is a really, really important distinction. There is nothing wrong with being proud of where you come from and the positive actions that your ancestors did or were a part of. That that is not a negative thing. It gets into negative when you start speaking of ancestors of being worshipped because they're just ancestors, because they came from this specific bloodline or race and stuff like that. That's where it gets really mucky, and guys, be really careful with that.
Right. And, this is just basically saying, have remembrance and, you know, give thanks to the family that came before you and that
Yeah.
paved the way for who your family is. And just it encourage you to, it encourages you to research your family back farther a little bit, even if it's only a little bit, even if it's only like 6, 7 generations back. But to and give thanks to those family members that came before you. And, that can be the start of, you passing on this practice so that you are remembered after you're gone, along with your parents and your parents' parents, and so on. And starting a practice of remembering more of your family heritage. And you can start a whole new way of your family remembering each other and actually um, eternal remembrance that they talk about in the book.
And that's a really important theory nowadays. I mean, because we live in the instant gratification culture nowadays. Everybody is living in the moment. They're living day to day from whatever they're doing to whatever they're doing in the next moment. There's not a lot of people nowadays that still look at the life they're leading as creating a legacy worth remembering. And it's important that we remember, and it ties again into the virtues and the Havamel and all that kind of stuff, is that you want to be leading a life worth having that honor, worth being remembered for. And that is something worth striving for, and it can be very different to everybody, but it is something worth always thinking about. You live your life like you want to be remembered. Make a difference, whatever it is, and you'll pass that down to the next, and it makes a big difference. It really does.
Right. And I remember because my grandparents came from a generation back when the Great Depression was going on.
Yep.
So my grandparents were very different when it came to making sure that they found a way to use everything that they had.
Yep.
They had hardly any waste.
Yep.
Any time that they bought something that had a container, they found a new use for the container. I remember my grandfather did a lot of woodworking and stuff. And so he had built these shelves in his basement in his wood room where he had taken the baby food jars and screwed the lids to the bottom of the shelf and used all the baby food jars to keep all of his different size screws and everything in.
Yeah. I I still have cashew jugs in my tool shed that have screws that are shit, probably 70 years old, that might were passed down to me, that I will probably end up passing down to my children at some point. But yeah, it's
And you
interesting
think of
how
how
that.
much stuff we throw away just to buy stuff to use for what we could have kept that and used it for. It's like we all buy these containers for putting our leftovers and everything in.
Yeah.
My grandparents had tons of whipped cream containers and butter containers and everything else. They didn't buy these container sets.
Yeah.
Every
Yeah.
time they had something that was a container, they kept it to use it.
Yeah. And
And you just
remembering.
look at, yeah, you look at how much stuff that we buy nowadays just to have it that we actually had if we had just saved stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, what we're doing right now is honoring the ancestors. What we're doing actively right now is looking at the different lifestyle, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the hardships that the people that came before us went through. And I know that when we're talking about screws and saving jars, it seems like a very generalized, and it is. But everybody can look into their past and find, you know, a family that was brave enough to start a new life, that was willing to try something new, that fought to protect freedom at some point. That, like, there's all of that has led to us being able to be here today doing what we're doing, not just as individuals, but as a society. And
Right.
looking back on those people that made that difference and that did lead by their actions, they're worth talking about. They're worth sharing those stories with. If I
Well,
pull those screws out of my tool chest and I'm working with somebody, I'm going to tell them the story of where it came from. I'm going to tell them about my grandfather. I'm going to pass that on. And that's what it's all about.
and
But when you really.
I'm a little bit older. So one thing that I remember from my early childhood that wasn't uncommon back then was my grandparents' previous vehicle was in the backyard sitting dead because they didn't trade cars back then. They would drive them till they were dead and they would park them in their yard. And there was the car back by the shed, back
Yep.
by the raspberry bushes that all the grass had grown up into and everything. And, it was an old Chevelle, or it was an old Chevy. And, it just sat back there in the backyard.
Yep. Well,
And
and
it's like,
even
you
that
don't
is.
see that nowadays.
No, and when you do come across, I mean, when you are out in the bush and you come across an old vehicle like that, it makes you think about that kind of stuff. It makes you remember driving in that old truck with your grandfather, or going hunting, or doing all kinds of that really cool shit. And again, it ties it back into looking at the positive actions of the people that came before us. And it's oddly simplistic, but very complicated at the same time. And it's which most things in heathenry are, which is why we all get into such big debates and fights over it sometimes, but it really does boil down to, honor the good deeds that came before you and don't be a dick. Like, like I don't know how to boil it down any simpler than that.
And not only that, but it's like, looking back to my grandparents, it's like, it makes me think, appreciate the things that you have. That's why they held on to so much and reused so much, is because they appreciated every little bit that they got. They didn't take anything for granted,
Because
because
you
they
never
did
knew.
grow up in a depression.
Yep. Yeah. You never knew when you were going to live without it. So you
Yep.
held on to it and repurposed things because that gave you a legit better chance of making it through. And that's not something we see a lot of in North America anymore. There is a very large safety net for a lot of people. I'm not trying to generalize this. I know that there are a lot of people out there struggling. I know that there are a lot of people out there in really hard. I'm speaking generally. The general normal flow of the population right now does exist with a very large safety net. If you want something, most of us are a few minutes away from a place that will provide that for you, whether it's groceries, a service, anything you need. And it wasn't like that back then. And you need to remember that the struggles of the people that came before us. I mean, I got into a really cool debate years ago when I was in university because I was 30 when I first started in university. So I was a lot older than the people that were currently starting their first years. And a lot of those people were a lot of the really early to mid millennials that were coming in, that when they did go through elementary and high school, they had access to Google, they had access to fast internet. Where I grew up, I didn't see internet on a school computer until I was in just about grade 8. By the time I graduated, Google was just Hotmail had just become a thing. MSN Messenger had just become a thing. The search engines that we have access to now were completely different. So when it came to just doing basic research, it was a completely different ballgame than it is now. So it just reminds you of how quick the lifestyle can change and how important it is to remember what the steps were that the people that came before us took to get us here, because A, it'll help guide you in making the right actions in your life, and B, it'll stop you from making the same mistakes if you pay attention to them. If you ignore history, you make the same mistakes. That's another term that gets kicked around and is conflicted a lot often, but it is very true.
Well, and it's funny because it's like, to go back to my grandparents again, it's like, I remember when my grandfather got his first computer. And I remember he set the typewriter up right next to the computer. And whenever he was doing a letter or anything, he would use a typewriter instead of using the computer and printing it out.
Yeah. Yeah, I still remember the old typewriters. I used to play with one all the time. I loved it.
Yeah, because my grandparents always had two typewriters. They had one in the family room, and then they had one in their kind of office area.
Yeah.
Because it's like, that's how they typed letters back then, was they got on the typewriter, and that thing was so heavy that you didn't want to have to lug it around. So they had two different ones. So like, if my grandmother wanted to type a letter, she could sit in the family room and type a letter. And if my grandfather was doing work, because he worked for the mail carrier service, and he would have to do a lot of typing, he had his desk and his little office where he'd do his typing.
Mm, that's awesome. And see, again, we're doing it right now. We're sharing those stories. It's important. That's So the book kind of leads into samples of ancestor worship, blots, meditation. I want to be really, really careful about us going into doing that kind of stuff live. When we did the offerings, and me and Redbeard both agreed with this, when we did the offerings live, it got intense. So I really want to encourage you guys to please read the sample blots, um, give them a try, go through them in your personal lives, do them with people you trust. They're in the next few pages. They're listed out simplistically, but they are basic and they are good ones. So please feel free to give them a go. I do not want to start reciting and speaking the words that are in that on live because I'm not going to have the right intent behind it because I'm not actually doing it right now. And I don't believe that that's a good thing to do. So
No, I
I do
totally agree.
encourage you to do this.
But
We will not be reading this part live
yeah,
just
and
because
one other thing that we got to mention is if you guys looked on the very title page above the chapter, it says, "We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us." So always remember, those that came before you guys, and research your history a little bit and do a little digging and find out, ask questions of, whatever elders are around you. Find out a little bit more about your heritage and hear some stories about different family members that maybe you had never heard about before. And you didn't know these stories because they're very interesting to learn. So I definitely encourage, um, and that's why I love that quote where it says, "We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us."
yeah. When
So,
we're very fortunate to have access to the DNA tests that we have now. Everybody can do those mail away things, and you can get a really detailed look at what your family tree looks like. And it's been really cool talking to people that I've not done it yet. Um, but I've been speaking to a lot of people that are at different stages of doing it, and the amount that they're learning about themselves, and it's really cool, and it does support that thing. You are standing on the shoulders of those that came before you, and there is nothing wrong with looking curiously into the past to see what your possible future could be, what lessons you can learn from that's something of value. That's not something that you should be ashamed of. Again, if you're
no,
doing
I
it for the
totally
right
agree.
reasons.
No, I totally agree. This has been a great chapter, you guys. We'll be going into the Q&A here pretty soon. Don't forget, Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Central, guys, we'll be going over chapter 5, the land fatir and other weights. Also, if you're not following us on our Instagram or on the Discord, please go follow those. Links are in our bios under the beacons page, you guys. And also click one of those 3 top support pages uh, to contribute and help keep this going. We are going to also be doing the raffle in the red room tonight, you guys. So if you are in it and you're not there, we'll get a hold of you if you do win. So don't worry if it gets too late and you can't be there. We got you covered. Anything else you want to cover before we sign off, Red?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody again, this coming Friday, our Friday fun episode, we are doing another community building. We are going to be doing painting with the community. So we are going to be in a single live running the boxes. Me and Redbeard will be doing our face paints up. So I encourage everybody that's in here, if you have access to face paints, if you have your brushes, grab your paints, come in on Friday. Let's do some paint together. Let's rock out some really cool videos together. We can throw videos onto the Discord. We can do whatever you guys want. It'll be a lot of fun. Um, Me and Redbeard will be here to give tips, and we will do this as a really painting for the first time, painting for the second time, painting on live is nerve wracking. Me and
Right.
Redbeard have been, and I know there's a lot of people that haven't had a chance to put a warband on or haven't had a chance to pick their Norse makeup or have had kind of a shitty response to that when they've tried to do it on their own. So if you wanna come hang out with us while we do our face paint, we're there. We're gonna have some fun. We're gonna have some stories. We're gonna have some good music. It's gonna be a fun ass night. So I definitely encourage you guys to all
Yeah.
be
So
there.
for those of you that have not seen me actually create Norris Mall, you'll get to see that for the first time. There are some people that have seen me. I don't usually do the face paint for Norris Mall on live. So I usually do it ahead of time, but I will be doing my Norse Mall on live Friday night. So that'll be fun.
And so I'm still debating on whether I'm going to be pulling out the Honored Dead OC or the Red Wolf OC. So I'll leave that up to you guys too. So jump into the general in the Discord. What paint do you want to see me do on Friday? Do you want to see the skull paint? Do you want to see the Norse paint? And the highest vote will get it. So it'll be something fun that you guys can do.
Right. And we just want to have a fun community night and spend some time with community, just having some fun and, enjoying each other. So, with that being said, you guys, remember, it's not a me thing, it's not a him thing, it's a we thing. We can't do it without each and every one of you. So, you guys stay amazing, stay creating, and always be awesome. And we'll see you Wednesday.